Thank you for joining us for the Oxford Internet Institute's fourth webinar of the term, featuring Professor Dean Freelon from the University of North Carolina, hosted by Felix M. Simon of the OII, discussing #heroes versus disinfo dystopia, the left, the right, and the truth about social media activism. A little housekeeping. We are fortunate to have a varied audience with a wide range of views, and we request the opinions of others are respected in this space. For your awareness, this event is being recorded and will be posted on our website following the event. Pose any question using the Q&A tab at any time, and these will be answered towards the end of the talk. And please try to keep questions as concise as possible. These will be visible to all attendees and can be upvoted and commented upon, and we will endeavour to follow up any unanswered queries. Please allow me to introduce Felix and Dean.
Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for tuning in today. I'm Felix, a doctoral student here at the Institute, and I'm more than excited to welcome Professor Dean Freelon to the OII today for his talk on social media activism in the US. And before I give the floor to Dean, just a couple of words on our speaker. Dean is currently Associate Professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where his work focuses on political expression through digital media and the development of computational social science approaches to study the same. And I think it's fair to describe Dean as one of the most prolific political communication scholars in the US these days. He's led important work that has looked at topics such as the proliferation of disinformation or political social media campaigns and movements. His work belongs to a growing body of scholarship that counters sometimes panic-infused punditry with rigorous and nuanced scientific analysis, with his public scholarship also enriching debates beyond the sometimes all too cloistered halls of academia, pushing topics that are vital for democracy out into the open. And now, without much further ado from my side, let me give the floor to Dean, and I look forward to your questions for him at the end of this talk. Dean, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for that very generous introduction, Felix. And welcome everyone to this webinar. The talk I'm going to give today, and I'm going to share my screen right now, is one that I've given a number of times in the past. Every time I give it, it's a little bit different. The topic, and I also want to apologize if you hear any banging. I'm having the windows on my house replaced. They said they were going to be done. They're not done. So hopefully that won't interrupt the scholarly knowledge transfer here. Anyway, as I was saying, the topic that I'm going to be discussing here, it changes a lot. So even though I've given this talk a number of times before, I think it'll be a little bit different in light of recent events that bear on the general topic that I'll be discussing. So this idea of #heroes versus disinfo dystopia, a dichotomous scholarly characterization that is the topic of this talk, is one that is quite ubiquitous, but one that I question the validity of. I think there are parts of it that are quite valid. I think there are parts of it that are a little bit unproven, and so I'll try to talk about that. And then I hope we can get into some good discussion during Q&A as we tease out some of the details here. So the broad context for this, I give this talk, I've given it to more scholarly audiences, I've given it to less scholarly audiences. I think this slide probably is one that is more for the less scholarly audiences, but for those who are not necessarily in this general area of research, the topic of digital social media activism has been an active research area for over 2 decades, and countless studies on this topic from a wide array of methodological approaches. Another one of these topics in which popular and scholarly interest remains strong. There have been lots of news articles written about this, non-academic commentators weighing in. So it really has a broad range of appeal. Computational social science is one of my specialties. It's a integral method that's really been applied to this alongside more traditional approaches, both quantitative and qualitative. So I wrote a paper about this. The citation for this is at the bottom of the screen if you want to check this out. And I assume this will also be made available with the archived version of this video. So I was approached at the end of 2019 by a science editor of the journal Science to write a review that looked at social media activism. And so that came out last September, I believe. And co-authored that with my colleagues, Alice Marwick and Daniel Kreis, both of the University of North Carolina. And we really looked at, some ideological asymmetries, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, But I do want to say that a more in-depth version of the argument that I'm going to give today is available in this paper. One thing that you will notice is I don't actually use the phrase #heroes versus disinformation dystopia. It's not exactly science's style. It's a little bit more florid than they tend to like it. But the substance of what I'm talking about today, most of it you'll be able to find in this paper if you're interested in the general topics that I discussed today. And so the first thing we talk about in this review is this idea of clicktivism and slacktivism, which are synonyms, the latter of which is somewhat more pejorative than the former, although one could argue that they're both somewhat pejorative. This is the idea that online engagement substitutes for real, quote unquote, offline engagement. So in other words, if you are retweeting and sharing content, if you're changing your profile picture and doing digital only activism, then that somehow is going to prevent you from doing activism in other ways. And so the literature provides almost no evidence of this substitution effect. And so typically what you end up seeing is when people engage in online activism, it tends to be an extension of their offline interests, right? So, and that's not only an activism thing, it is general to whatever interests you may have. So if you're interested in music, or you're interested in, you know, arts, or if you're interested in whatever it is, you tend to express that interest both online and offline. And so people who are not interested in politics tend not to engage either online or offline, is what the literature has tended to find here. There is some evidence that this clicktivism or slacktivism can serve as something as a gateway for offline or more sustained high-cost activism. Bodie 2017 provides evidence of this. Some colleagues and I also provide some evidence of it in a 2016 report we did on the early days of the Black Lives Matter movement. But we certainly need more research that will tell us the extent to which clicktivism or slacktivism can serve as a gateway activity toward more in-depth activism, as opposed to a supplement to people who are already interested in a particular issue. Most relevant research looks at political engagement in an undifferentiated way. So they don't necessarily make distinctions between different issues that people are interested in, and the extent to which clicktivism may play into issues that are where people are part of a given issue public versus issues with which they are more tangentially involved. And so this kind of research tends to ask generally about things like voting, signing petitions, campaign volunteering, and don't really make those issue-specific distinctions quite so much. And so one possibility that we explore in the piece is that people's level of commitment to different issues might affect their willingness to engage in high versus low effort activism. And so we advocate that that is a really important direction for this research to go in. Certainly prior research in theory on issue publics and things like that suggest that may be the case, but I don't think, I'm not aware of any research that's demonstrated that. If there is some, I'm happy to be corrected on that, but in our literature review, we did not find any. And then there's this question that really gets to the heart of what we're talking about in the review and in this presentation, which is the question of whether clicktivism works differently for the left versus the right. There's very little evidence of this thus far. You know, one question is it a more effective gateway for one rather than the other? Certainly a good area of research, and one that points toward the central dichotomy that animates this presentation as well as the review. So theoretically, you know, we come to this via one of the lowest theoretical bars in political communication to satisfy, which is ideological asymmetry. Basically, all you have to do is demonstrate that the right and left do something differently to a different extent or differently qualitatively. So these are systematic differences in left-right beliefs and behaviors. There are plenty of examples of this. The fact that, for example, conservatives trust mainstream news less. They have a stronger preference for ideological echo chambers. They share more false news and disinformation. And they also tolerate politicians spreading disinformation more than the left. And so these are just examples, and there are a number of other ones, but this really, I think these are sufficient to demonstrate the point that ideological asymmetries sort of span a wide range of cognitions and behaviors that tend to be fairly stable, and they paint a picture of the contemporary left as compared to the contemporary right. Some of these differences are international in scope. Some of them are more specific to the United States, but this is a major area of research, just given the extent to which conservatives and liberals behave differently apart from their specific policy preferences. And so this brings us to the central dichotomy of this presentation, which is #heroes versus disinformation dystopia, which is visually represented by the two sides of this slide. So let's start on the left, where we have the #heroes component. If you take a look at the sort of hashtags emblazoned on the pound sign here, you'll notice very quickly that all of them, without exception, are left-leaning hashtags, right? Resistance, Field to Burn, no Dakota Access Pipelines, Black Girl Magic, She Persisted, intersectional feminism, and on down the line. And so what that symbolizes is that the idea of #activism is one that both in the literature, the scholarly literature, as well as the popular imagination, this idea of #activism is associated primarily, if not exclusively, with the left. And so that is who's seen to engage in it. And that is, where most of the research has really focused that's looked at #activism, has looked at how the left has used it. Now, disinformation dystopia is sort of the opposite of that. This is the idea that disinformation and all of the bad things that go along with it are primarily, if not exclusively, associated with the right. And so, whether we're talking about InfoWars, Gateway Pundit, Fox News, Breitbart, whatever, this is seen as a problem for the right. First of all, it is constructed as a problem normatively. And secondly, it is seen as a problem that disproportionately, or perhaps entirely, affects the right wing, to which they are susceptible, either knowing or unknowing participants in the spreading of negative and false and uncharitable claims about the other side that are intended to damage them, which is what disinformation is. So this is just, and so, there's some holes in the literature that very recently have started to be filled. And so I created this table a while ago, a few months ago, and I think that we have a little bit more, we know a little bit more about this now. But I think it's still the case that when you think about left #activism and right-wing, alternative media ecosystems, mis and disinformation, those squares on this table are very, very well filled with tons and tons of research that go back several years. But when you think about right #activism and left-wing mis and disinformation, there's a lot less on that. And so there are a couple of possibilities with that. And so when I consider that there are holes in the literature, there are a couple of reasons for that. One is simply that there is no, or very, very little, left-wing disinformation and very little right-wing #activism, and thus the literature as it stands reflects true ideological divisions and online activism operating strategies. So we're all good, no, nothing to see here, don't need to go any deeper, and that's just, the allocation of scholarly attention is basically keyed to the empirical reality. Second possibility on the right hand of the slide is that there is insufficient research on, firstly, right-wing #activism, and secondly, left-leaning disinformation, and that in turn is generating an incomplete empirical portrayal. Of course, there's also the possibility that the truth is somewhere in between, right? And so, so much of what is actually true here, where the truth actually lies, has to do with the extent to which scholars are willing to investigate these possibilities. And that can be hard to distinguish, there's publication bias and the rest of that. So it can be hard to distinguish whether folks have looked and there's nothing there, or whether they simply are ignoring content that is present. And so we're trying to tease that out right now. So I do, before I go on any further, I want to talk about, the difference between the existence of disinformation that appeals to one ideological side or the other, and the danger that that disinformation may pose. And so, normatively, I feel it's incumbent upon myself to point out that we've seen the danger, the distinct danger of right-wing disinformation here in the United States. We saw it on January 6th. Lives lost, and of course, confidence in the security of our legislative, buildings being compromised there. And so even if it is true that there is disinformation found in sectors that appeal to segments of the ideological spectrum other than the right, it nevertheless, I think it's true that right-leaning disinformation has some consequences that are more serious than disinformation that appeals to other segments of the ideological spectrum. And I think that's important to understand. So the prevalence of the content itself versus its actual consequences. Over the last couple of months, I personally have become convinced that there has become, or that the evidence for right-wing disinformation has actually increased. Very recently, the links that are on this slide are from the last few months. They came out actually since I started giving this presentation, so I thought it was really important to acknowledge that as a quantitative matter, it does seem that there has been more far-right disinformation of late. So prior to, a few months ago, there had been some indications that this was true, but a lot of this disinformation studies that we'd seen, the data actually came from prior to the 2016 election. So in other words, there were some possibilities that maybe things changed after the election, with Trump in power and the rest of that. But with the recent studies, I personally have been convinced that as a quantitative matter, right-wing disinformation is actually more so in evidence. I think the jury's in on that. That having been said, I think that just because there's more of it doesn't mean necessarily that left-wing disinformation isn't important or that it doesn't convince people. But certainly, I think as a quantitative matter, the evidence on the side that right-wing disinformation predominates and eclipses that of the left side, I think is pretty strong, and I haven't seen any evidence to the contrary of that, or certainly not at the strength of the evidence in favor of that proposition. So we want to be able to say that, or we can say rather, that the following two propositions enjoy strong methodologically diverse empirical support. Firstly, hashtag activism, actually it's 2 slides before, hashtag activism is a widely used and effective mode of online activism for the left. We know this is true. There have been tons of studies that have shown this. Secondly, the right has its own alternative media ecosystem, which is firstly, disproportionately tolerant of mis and disinformation, and secondly, closely networked with ideological leaders, including Trump and many prominent members of Congress and media personalities. This is a very big difference from what we see on the left. Although that doesn't mean that there couldn't be alternative distribution mechanisms for disinformation that have not been adequately conceptualized in the scholarly literature. Right. And so here is the 2016 stuff I talked about earlier. So this corroborates the stuff I showed on the slides, slide that was 2 slides ago. And so these basically demonstrate, again, that point that prior to the 2016 election, we did tend to see more disinformation on the right. We now have evidence from 2020 immediately before the election and afterward, and that also is true. And so I think that when you put this evidence together with the evidence I showed on 2 slides prior, that's pretty strong evidence that this is true. But I also want to point out that this quantitative difference is not one that should lead people to believe that other types of disinformation are not necessarily prevalent or not worthy of study, but simply that as a quantitative matter, there tends to be more on the right-hand side than on the left, at least in the US context. So I want to, again, there's sort of 2 things I'm talking about here, the hashtag activism piece as well as the disinformation. We know a lot more about disinformation than we do about hashtag activism in sectors other than the left. Yeah, so in terms of hashtag activism. So one of the cases that I put out here that seems to link hashtag activism conceptually to the left comes from this book that you may be familiar with, which is called Hashtag Activism: Networks of Race and Gender Justice, which is a great book by Jackson, Bailey, and Foucault Wells. Absolutely recommend it. Great perspective, very nice and innovative mix of critical theory with computational methods. And I really hope that future research takes that hint from this particular book. But one thing that I disagree with is this highlighted passage, which seems to me to tie hashtag activism conceptually to the left. And so, it says, throughout this text, we use hashtag activism to refer to the strategic ways counter-public groups and their allies on Twitter employ this shortcut to make political contentions about identity politics, and this is the key part, that advocate for social change, identity redefinition, and political inclusion. And so to me, this is a conceptual move that makes it very difficult to connect the performative aspects, not performative is the wrong word, but the procedural aspects of hashtag activism to ideologies outside of the left, right? So rather than having this be an empirical question, it's sort of tied together on the front end and saying, okay, well, if it's hashtag activism, that has to be on the left. And so the question is, what happens when people in other segments of the ideological spectrum apply these same kinds of tactics? Do we still call it hashtag activism? Is that reserved for the left? These are really important questions that we need to think about when we're trying to apply these concepts to different segments of the ideological spectrum. And so you also see this on the other side. This passage comes from Network Propaganda, another great book by Benkler, Farris, and Roberts, really foundational in this area and a really magisterial empirical work in its own right. And so, here you've got this statement that says that a population with high trust in bias confirming news and high distrust and bias disconfirming professional norms driven media will be more vulnerable to disinformation campaigns than a population that has generally higher trust in professional journalism on average, but lower trust in any given media outlet. So it's pretty clear who they're talking about here, the right and the left. So this idea being that the mainstream media serves as a bulwark against mis and disinformation content, and the on the right, the right-wing media ecosystem strongly encouraging content that is bias confirming, and where that allows an opening for mis and disinformation basically to thrive. And so that sort of builds in, once again, this idea that there are structural forces that militate against the left consuming or engaging with disinformation, which may well be true, but to hang it all on the mainstream media, I think, is an interesting choice, and one that needs a bit of critique, which I'll do in just a moment. So I did find it notable, and this obviously is very much in line with the general thesis of the book, but as far as I could find, Network Propaganda only mentions a single case of potential left-wing disinformation. It's from the summer of 2016. It's an allegation that Trump participated in child rape at some point, right? And so when they discuss it, they talk about how mainstream news basically didn't really go anywhere with it. It sort of emerged from sort of the middle of nowhere, and because mainstream news didn't really discuss it that much, it didn't get much traction. And so the basic argument here is that such claims are less relevant because they are largely ignored by mainstream news outlets, which is not the case for right-wing media, as I said. However, right, it's 2021, mainstream media hasn't been the only game in town for a very long time. And it is quite possible that disinformation may have other effects that are unrelated to mainstream news engagement, right? And I provide some basic potential evidence of this in a little bit. So here's another possibility, right? And so this actually refers to the exact same piece of disinformation, but there was a new set of, I said the set of disclosures wasn't new, but there was some new publicity around this on May 31st, almost a year ago. 2020, the anonymous hacktivist collective released a cache of documents purporting to prove that Trump was involved in child sex trafficking. And once again, as Benkler et al. Predicted, this was almost entirely ignored by mainstream media sites. But the story managed to pick up 1.1 million retweets within 3 to 4 days. And so I think something like this when you're thinking about potential alternative distribution networks, this really deserves a lot more study and engagement. We don't know who's sharing this content, how it fits with the rest of the media diets. We don't know what the similarities and differences are in right-wing disinformation sharing in terms of where it comes from, how far it goes, who's most susceptible to it. And so this, I think this is highly suggestive. I don't think it's conclusive in any way, but it certainly does invite future research to figure out what exactly is going on here. Right, and so here's some data, here's some very, very basic data I pulled from this. And so this is coming from the tweets that mention Anonymous and Trump, May 31st to June 3rd. You can see You're Non-Central at the left-hand side of the chart, which is the main Twitter account for the Anonymous Collective. And what's interesting is the rest of these user accounts, none of them are political in nature. Right, these are mostly accounts that post about anime and K-pop and other fun stuff. They manage, some of them may be bots, I don't know, but they managed to get a lot of attention from this story. And so, if it is some kind of influence campaign, that would be interesting. If it's actual people doing this, that would also be interesting. So, trying to figure out what exactly is going on here, I think, is a major challenge for anybody who is really interested in unveiling the true story of disinformation and how it happens across the ideological divide. Here's another evidence. Here's another piece of evidence for this. This actually is a little bit old. It comes from 2016 election. I believe this is from October, I want to say, in 2016. And BuzzFeed, not exactly a scholarly, found of scholarly knowledge, but what they did do was they looked at three Facebook pages each between the left and the right, and they rated a bunch of posts on these pages, mostly false, mix of true and false, mostly true or no factual content. And what I find really remarkable about this chart is that if you look at the left, charts, there's a fair amount of, mostly false and mix of true or false content on these left-leaning pages. And actually, if you take a look at the y-axes, they are not equivalent. The left one tops out at 20,000, the right one tops out at 5,000. So those numbers, actually, those red bars are actually, especially for Occupy Democrats and the other 98%, those are higher than any of the right bars. And certainly, BuzzFeed is not part of the right-wing media ecosystem, so this is certainly not something where you expect them to be trying to make the left look bad. And so I think, and again, these are only 3 sites each, so again, not definitive, but really does invite future analysis to figure out whether this is representative and what's behind this. Another one is, I don't know whether you're familiar with Seth Abramson. He's a sort of a left-leaning journalist. He's not really a journalist. He's more of like an aggregator. But he really is sort of a resistance hero, or he was, probably still is, during the Trump administration. Wrote 3 books about, how Trump was about, on the verge of getting, impeached or removed from office or whatever. But one of the things this article points out is that he was often wrong. And so he would sort of put out all these breathless things about, collusion between Trump and Russia. But a lot of that content ended up being incorrect. Now, I think this really sort of invites us to take a bit of a step back and think about what disinformation actually is. You think about spreading content that is intended to damage somebody else. You think about falsehood, and then you think about sort of knowledge of the falsehood. And so you want to think about some of the epistemological processes that give rise to some of these incorrect allegations, and think about the implications of the reality that when those same processes are followed over and over again, and somebody keeps being wrong, you really have to ask yourself what's really going on there. So the piece itself doesn't accuse Seth Abramson of distributing disinformation, but I do think it's worth noting that following that process repeatedly and arriving at wrong conclusions, I think certainly does get a little bit too close to that category for my personal comfort level. Right? So when it comes to left-wing disinformation, there's little doubt that there's at least some out there. We don't know nearly as much about it. So just simply as a matter of characterizing it relative to right-wing disinformation, I think that's really important. It's also really important to recognize that even null results are valuable. So this is the difference I alluded to earlier when I talked about, the difference between, absence of evidence and evidence of absence, right? So the fact that, is it that people haven't done the research on stuff that actually exists, or it doesn't exist so people haven't done the research? And that, because of publication biases, is very, very difficult to tell. This is a little ad for something I'm working on, and I think it will really help to understand these left-right disinformation patterns. And so the idea here is, this is what I call a filter map. And the idea is that it basically aligns information sources along two axes, a left-right axis, which is represented in the horizontal dimension, and an information quality dimension, which is represented vertically. And so the idea is that you want folks that are above that x-axis, that would be that they are, would mean rather, that they are more truthful than false. The up and down axis is actually represented by Politico fact check scores. So the more pants on fire ratings you have, the further down to the bottom you are. And so the idea here is that I'm actually working on doing an actual version of this. This is just a mock-up of software that produces this for participants that I'm going to recruit in the study. And so the idea then would be to try to figure out, if you have people on the left and the right, which ones tend to engage with content that falls below that x-axis, low information quality content. So this, I think, will help us to understand exactly how this plays out on a left-right basis. And because these visualizations will also be available to the people who participate in the study, it will help them understand their level of engagement with low and high credibility content, so that ideally they can help to adjust their own information consumption patterns to maximize high information quality content and minimize low information quality content. And so now we've sort of come to this question of hashtag activism on the right. So so my general approach to this is, if hashtag activism is a set of tactics, it should theoretically be applicable by individuals outside the left. There's little research on how often this is attempted on the right, let alone success rates. However, anecdotal evidence suggests something resembling hashtag activism does exist on the right. So you may be aware of these, right? Boycott, Netflix, Budweiser, Keurig, right? So a lot of that hashtag activism on the right is about boycotting various companies. I don't know whether you noticed, whether you saw this, but there was there's a new ad campaign that's coming out against woke capitalism. So they're going to run all these ads against Coca-Cola and American Airlines and things of this nature. And so that's something, an area where the right has really been active from the Trump administration up to now. And so whether this is considered to be hashtag activism, I think, is a really important question, given that a lot of the stuff is hashtagged. There's been some indication that possibly maybe there's not a whole lot of follow through with these kinds of things, or many people promoting this were not consumers of the products in the first place. But that, again, is an empirical question. We need to figure this out. Certainly people are engaging with this on a performative level, if in no other reason, or if for no other purpose. So I think it is worth considering or asking the question whether this could be considered to be hashtag activism. So, and I would say that at first glance, some of these hashtags do seem to mimic the left-wing hashtag activism playbook. Rigorous research should ask, what are the similarities and differences between left and right? Who's behind these hashtags? What are the effects? What are the news media and political elite response, and et cetera? There has been some very basic existing research on this. So there was an analysis of R the Donald that sort of mentioned some of the hashtags that are right-leaning, and sort of in passing, wasn't the main focus of the study, but they kind of waved their hands out a little bit in the beginning. There was also a study I found that looked at boycott Starbucks and boycott Budweiser from a corporate social responsibility, corporate social activism perspective, but not really a political communication perspective, which I think is really, really important to understanding the political utility of these kinds of campaigns. So I do think that these activities need to be conceptualized either within or distinct from the existing hashtag activism umbrella. If you're going to say that it's not hashtag activism, I think we need to figure out what we do want to call it, and how we can connect it with what we know about what happens on the left using very similar instrumentalities. So what do we do now, right? So left-wing disinformation, right-wing hashtag activism are understudied at best. We need to rectify this to gain a more complete picture of the ideological asymmetries that characterize online activism. Very important to understand, this is not false balance, right? So if disinformation turns out to be primarily a right-wing phenomenon, so be it. We've seen some evidence that that it does tend to predominate on the right. There's more of it on the right than on the left. We need to do the work to find out, not only to answer the quantitative question, but also qualitatively in terms of characterizing these forms of activism as they play out on the left and right. I also want to say that the normative implication of the hashtag heroes disinformation dystopia divide strongly recommend that we firm up the empirical foundations on this as much as possible. I think it puts, I can't really speak for anybody else, but as somebody who is, somewhat to the left of the political spectrum, it puts me in sort of a strange position to basically argue that all the really bad normative activism stuff, that is disinformation, happens on the other side of the aisle. That's not something, because that is in some level of self-serving argument, that's not an argument I want to make unless it has very, very strong empirical support. So that's part of why that's important to me. And also, if there is disinformation on the left, it turns out you can do a lot more work in terms of tamping down and eliminating disinformation when it comes on the side that you are a part of. So that's why, for a personal reason, I'm interested in this, because I know that I can have more of an influence in terms of tamping down left-leaning disinformation than I ever could with the right wing, because I'm not part of that political side. I'm going to stop there. Let's see, how long have I gone? About 40 minutes. That's pretty cool. So pieces out, read it, cite it, love it. And I am here for questions.
Thank you so much for this fascinating presentation, Dean. I will just probably have two questions because we are a little bit short of on time, but let me start with a really broad one. How did you end up studying this particular topic? When did you first realize, hang on, there might be something here?
When? Well, the general idea behind ideological asymmetry is that there's two sides. So when I see a whole lot of research that's looking at one side, and my first instinct is to say, well, what about the other side, right? Now, when this happens in journalism, like, people are like, oh, it's false balance, whatever, but empirically, I think it is incumbent upon us to take a real hard look at what's going on with the kinds of mis and disinformation that we see out there. And there simply just hasn't really been a lot of research on that. And a lot of the research that does exist doesn't really characterize the disinformation itself. So in other words, like some of the studies, the big studies that came out on 2016 would say things like, well, we've got, 30 million units of, right-wing disinformation and 15 million units of left. Those aren't like real numbers, but there's more right-wing disinformation than there's left-wing. But it doesn't really tell you a whole lot about qualitatively what's going on, what's in it. Are they appealing to similar kinds of partisan or ideological biases? What are the impact? What is the impact? What are the subgroups within each of the ideological strata which is most affected by this? What are the effects of it? And so that, I think, is what's really interesting to me, just because the basic structure of the ideological asymmetry thesis, I think, really cries out for that kind of analysis. But it really does seem to me that the vast majority of the energy has gone disproportionately into studying certain sides of this. And I saw a very interesting kind of parallelism between what's happening with hashtag activism on the left and what's going on with disinformation on the right. And so that's why I chose to frame it that way.
Right, thank you. Just another one. What would you say to the hypothesis that the right might be less reliant on hashtag activism, assuming that this is true? Because they have this alternative media system which basically tells them together, and they don't sort of need these hashtags to draw them together as a group and sort of as a community.
I mean, I think that's absolutely a interesting question, but it's an empirical one. So, if somebody were to say that to me, I'd say, like, great, go do the study and tell me whether it's true or not. So, I mean, I think it's absolutely possible. But I think it's a very interesting proposition, this question of whether hashtags on the left and the right-wing media ecosystem on the right serve similar purposes. I mean, they're not equivalent, right? I mean, they're certainly, the hashtags that the left puts out there don't have the same money or reach that the right-wing media ecosystem does. And so I think it's an interesting question to figure out what aspects of the what sort of activist or protest-based aspects are satisfied, in other words, by hashtag activism versus the right-wing media ecosystem. But to my knowledge, nobody's done that research. So anybody out there who wants to do it, I think it's a very important and interesting topic for future research.
Excellent, cool. We'll let them know. I will now jump to the audience question, and I think I'll start off with a question by Phil Howard, who asks, most of your work is in a US context where there's a huge political category of independence. In some ways, there are no real independents, but in others, they are a pretty resilient category. How do independents fit into your spectrum for hashtag activism or misinformation consumption?
Great. Well, thank you for that question, Phil. For those who don't know, Phil was on my dissertation committee and was a great member of the University of Washington Communication Department faculty before decamping to Oxford. And anyway, so yeah, I think that's absolutely an interesting question. Part of, I think, answering that is a little bit difficult because our metrics for figuring out where people are on the ideological spectrum are not great, especially on social media. We have some alternatives. I think they go some ways toward answering that question. They're not really, they're not perfect though. And they may not necessarily be super effective for people who are in the middle relative to people who are on the extremes. So in other words, you might, reasonably conclude that people who follow lots of hard left, sites or follow lots of hard left accounts are on the hard left, same for the hard right. People who follow a mix may or may not be in the center. And so I think the question of independence is a really interesting one because typically when you look at disinformation, whether it's on the left or the right, it tends to appeal to people's very strong ideological biases. And so I think that raises the question of what would a independent or center-focused disinformation appeal to, if not those sort of very hard ideological commitments? And that's a very interesting question. I'm not really sure of what it would be. We know that there are certain forms of disinformation and misinformation that are not necessarily political in nature, right? So these sort of like wildly satirical claims about, sharks swimming down, Houston streets or whatever in the wake of hurricanes, that sort of thing. And so that's one possibility. It may also be that people who put this stuff out there are primarily trying to target folks that are on the extremes, because that is that's where the money is. That's where the action is. But it could be. It's certainly an interesting question, and I'm really interested if people are doing research on this. I absolutely would love to know the answer.
Great, and we've got another question from, I hope I pronounce this correctly now, Arik Chowdhury, and he asked, does the research on left and right hashtag activism take into account age differences?
Oh my goodness, they're really going at it back there. Sorry, I got the question. The answer is yes. It does take into account age. Some of it does. Taking age into account generally does require things like it requires surveys that take people's age down. So, for example, it's pretty hard to get precise information on people's ages when you're just looking at social media data. So if you do have, like, for example, a matched panel of folks who are filling out surveys, and you're also able to do things like track their social media activity, or if you have voter file information that has age data on it, you can do that. But that obviously is a bit of a heavier lift to be able to determine that. And there are, the studies have looked at that, have found major age effects. People who are older tend to be more susceptible to this kind of thing, tend to spread it more, tend to believe it more. And so age, yes, does tend to be a factor in the spreading and consumption of disinformation.
Excellent, thank you. And I go to another question from Victoria Nash, our new director, and she asks, you referenced your own personal political values in the talk and are clearly conscious of the role these may play in motivating research. What advice do you have for faculty students in terms of being reflective on how our values shape our own research?
Oh, wow, great question. I think I had one of my old professors when I was in grad school used to love to say that all research is autobiographical. So everything that we do is, in some sense, I mean, maybe this is a bit of a bit of a cliche or a bit obvious, but everything that we do is a reflection of our interests. Everything that we do is a reflection of the things that we consider to be important. I was recently reading an interesting piece that was looking at, it wasn't looking at communication research, it was actually looking at research on police violence. And it basically argued that, there are some questions or some, empirical studies that should basically be dismissed for ideological reasons, or at least that's how I read it. And I don't really think that, I don't really agree with that. I think that one of the most important qualities that an empirical researcher can have is to be willing to allow the empirical chips to fall where they may, right? And that doesn't necessarily entail any kind of abridgment of one's norms or one's values. It simply means that the facts are what they are, right? And then when you do research, and when you pull research together on a given topic, and you try to look at where the bulk of that research tilts, or the story that it's trying to tell, that those conclusions should not be influenced by one's ideology. What can be influenced by one's ideology, what probably should be, is what to do about it, right? So I think really keeping a tight grasp on that fact value distinction is really, really important. So the chips need to be able to fall where they may, but at the same time, that doesn't necessarily mean that anything goes normatively, right? I mean, that doesn't mean that we're going to necessarily take, alt-right ideology, or, incel or men's rights ideology seriously as a normative matter. But to be able to study it and understand it and figure out what's going on with it, I think empirically is something that we can do in ways that are true to whatever the empirical findings are. And I think that's something we absolutely should keep in mind as we're doing research on these topics that are very politically charged.
Wonderful, thank you. On the empirical note, we have another question from Sarah Atik, who asks, do we have country-wise empirical evidence on right-wing posts driving more engagement or most engagement on Facebook? Like, do countries that have left-leaning governments and popular support also generate more engagement on right-wing social media posts?
We have very strong evidence to that effect for the United States. I'm not sure about for other countries. And so that's been, I've seen so many of these top 10 most shared on Facebooks, where it's all, Ben Shapiro and other sort of right-leaning sources. And that's, there's a lot of evidence that happens on Facebook, and that's true on Facebook, at least for the United States. I think it would be interesting to see whether that is true in a cross country or international perspective. I'm not sure if there's research to that effect. That might be something where you might need to collaborate with Facebook to be able to figure that out. But I think that we do have very strong evidence that is the case, at least recently, for the United States.
Excellent. And another question from Leonard Schultz, who says, thank you for the great talk. What role does the praxis of self-staging on platforms like Instagram play for both sides of the political spectrum and the two different strategies of social media activism?
That's a good question. I don't know a ton about Instagram. One of the things that makes Instagram a little bit less of an attractive platform for the kind of politics that plays out on Facebook and Twitter is that you can't post outside links. So you can't link to content that is part of the right-wing media ecosystem or any other media ecosystem, even mainstream media. And so that means that the politics necessarily, by dint of the way that the platform is constructed, takes on a different character that is more enclosed. So that would absolutely be an interesting, study to do. I think there has been some. I confess I'm not really up on the research on political Instagram. I think a lot of it sort of follows a cultural politics model that looks at things like appropriation and that looks at sort of fashion and that sort of thing. So I know that's big. There've been several studies on that. I'm not really sure about how, for example, disinformation or even hashtag activism plays out within an Instagram context, but I do think that would be really interesting to take a look at. And now you've got me interested. I want to check to see if there are any studies on this because I'm really curious to see. And I do think that they would probably play out differently just because of the different ways that the sites are set up.
Great. And another one from Hekal Al-Azyari, who asks, does the phenomenon of hashtag heroes versus disinformation dystopia typically tend to be constrained with social and political, or within social and political spectrums? How much do you think the normative framework of a state's control over the internet and media weighs towards the progress of such phenomena?
Yeah, so I do want to say that this hashtag, this is the one thing that like all Americans forget to do. This is definitely like a study of the United States, right? So we have a very particular media ecosystem or media setup. The state is largely out of it, and that's very different from what obtains in many other countries. And so I think that what you're going to see, what you do see in the United States is going to be very particular to it. And so I think that, yeah, if you do have countries that have very, very strong state-run media sectors, you can have a very different pattern of the extent to which people are going to engage in disinformation versus hashtag activism. So, and that may very well depend on where the government is leaning. You have a left-leaning government, you can have a very different, probably, my guess would be, you'd have a very different dynamic than if your government was quite right-leaning. And so, it may very well be the case that in some countries, if, for example, there was a right-leaning government that really is sort of pressing forward and running the media, that may very well mirror a lot of what's happening with the right-wing media ecosystem here in the States. And so that's a great question. I think that one nice thing about research that's based in the United States is it sort of invites a very important and easy theoretical hook for exporting those theories to other countries to say, here is what happens in the United States. We're trying to figure out whether this also is happening in other countries, or whether we need to develop new theories to figure out what's happening in other countries.
Excellent, great. And we have another question from Ralf Schroeder, also from the Oxford Internet Institute, who asks, could you say a little about where your research agenda is going into the future? What do you find most exciting now we're in the Biden era?
Yeah, so good thing that was typed up because I didn't hear a thing you just said, but I did see when your lips stopped moving. So now I realize it's time for me to start talking. Okay, so what am I interested in? So one of the things that I really want to answer and get into is I have a very strong suspicion, although this could probably be wrong, that political communication research, especially in the United States, is missing a very substantial segment of the extreme left. And so throughout the Trump administration, a number of studies, including one I worked on, basically said that the extreme left doesn't really exist. But then, Biden comes in and I start seeing a whole lot of activity on what I would consider the extreme left. So I'm talking about people who call themselves socialists, anarchists, communists. You may be familiar with this term tanky, which is celebration or advocacy of the authoritarian left, rehabilitation of 20th century authoritarian communists like Stalin and Mao. And so I have a very strong suspicion that some of the metrics that have been used to place people in ideological buckets may be missing folks on the extreme left. So I'm currently involved in a study where I'm basically going to develop an innovative way of characterizing folks based on how they self-describe, and comparing that to some of the existing metrics of ideological scaling, and trying to figure out how much those match up, and to try to figure out, because it may very well be the case that the efficacy of these scaling mechanisms work really well for certain segments of the ideological spectrum, but not others. And so the first question is, how effectively do these existing scaling mechanisms characterize the extreme left? Second question looks at media content engagement. Are they engaging with mainstream media? Do they have their own media ecosystem? And then potentially there are some metrics that I can introduce that look at information quality as well. So all that put together, I think, makes a nice little study and a nice little look at the extreme left, which I think has really been neglected, especially in the American context. Another study I'll be looking at over the summer is I'm actually doing a study that actually doesn't have anything to do with social media at all. I'm doing research that looks at the gender and racial diversity of the most cited people in the communication discipline. And so for that, I'm using data that comes from Web of Knowledge. So I pulled out a bunch of people who were highly cited by the top communication journals over the past 20 years. And then I'm looking at the extent to which different characteristics, both of national origin, institution, race, and gender, drive attention to those individuals' works. And so that's part of it. If you're familiar with some of the research, communication so white, communication so weird, kind of falls into that general sort of bucket of research, as well as the bibliometric tradition and sort of meta research of that pretty much exists in most of the larger social sciences, but certainly communication. So those are kind of the two big studies I'm working on. I also have a couple that I'm sort of tangentially involved in, but those are kind of the two that I'm trying to get done by the end of the summer.
Will this latest study you've mentioned also help in answering this question about the origins of the blind spots when it comes to research on the topic you just talked about?
Sorry, what was the question?
Sorry. So basically, what the latest study you're currently working on, the sort of bibliographical study, do you think that could help in answering the origin of these blind spots when it comes to hashtag activism versus the disinformation dystopia?
Yeah, I mean, I think it could. I mean, I go back to this idea that all research is autobiographical, and there's a general trend. I mean, if you look at communication theory, it really has not done a great job at addressing questions of identity more generally and race specifically. And so now we're starting to, there have been papers that come out that have talked about this. And when you have a field that's like mostly white, I mean, like, I think that there's going to be a tendency to not get into that quite as much. And so as our field diversifies, as it becomes more inclusive of multiple perspectives, I think you're going to see this critique over and over again. One of the things I really want my study to do, the bibliometric one, is to provide basically a benchmark for the level of diversity that exists in the top journals at this point. And then, 10 years down the road, we can do it again and figure out how much has changed, right? So I know the president of ICA, International Communication Association, he's definitely committed to doing better on this score. He has some specific ideas about how he wants to diversify ICA and its journals. And so what I want to be able to do in 10 years is to say, let's rerun this methodology and check those numbers again and see whether those metrics or those initiatives that we've tried to implement to diversify the discipline have actually had the intended effect.
Excellent. I mean, yeah, that's I mean, it's really important, and it goes to show that what empirical evidence actually can do. I mean, I've seen this in other research, for instance, in journalism, when it comes to diversity in journalism, where actually having the numbers then has helped to increase diversity and really make a case for making a difference. Where even though we knew about these problems before, without the numbers, for some reason, it didn't seem to be as valid. And so having the numbers really helped.
Well, yeah, I mean, the whole point of the numbers is that you can measure progress. So if things are going in the right direction, if they're going in the wrong direction, you really need to know the answers to these questions. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, I think with that, we are actually at the end of this hour, unfortunately. Thanks so much again for your time, Dean, for finding the time to join us and for this brilliant talk and discussion, for answering all these diverse questions. And of course, thanks a lot to our audience for asking them. And yeah, we very much look forward to seeing you again in the future. And thanks. Have a great evening, everyone.
Great. Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for coming, everyone.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you, Felix and Dean, for a fascinating insight today, and thank you all for attending. You will receive a follow-up email in due course. The OII hosting our next webinar on Wednesday, the 26th of May at 6 p.m. UK time, where we will meet the 4 editors of the book, Your Computer is on Fire. Please visit the events page on the OII website to sign up. Thank you again, and have a wonderful day.